You know, skills are important for prepping, and I think one of the skills preppers should consider is learning how to grow your own food. You know, your own vegetables, gardening, so to speak, or farming if you're ambitious enough. And if you didn't grow up in a family that gardened, you may not quite know where to start. So what people usually do then is to turn to what I call the flavor of the month. And that is what is the most popular gardening method out there. You know, it's just like the most popular diet method. Well, in this case, it's gardening method. And right now, I think among prepperdom and homesteaders, it is the Back to Eden garden. Is that the best approach for you to take? Maybe, maybe not. Let me explain why. First, let me give you a little background about my own gardening experience. Both my parents came from farms, and according to my mom, they couldn't hurry away fast enough to get into the city. But they both had growing skills. And my mom always kept a small garden, and my brother kept a bigger garden. And I wasn't interested in it at all growing up. I mean, who wants to weed, right? That's not any fun. But then after I had my children, I got involved. I wanted to know the safety of their food. And one of the safest ways was if I grew it myself and I knew what went into the soil. So I ended up reading a lot of books at the time. And I definitely was more interested in the no-tilling method because that just seemed like it was better for the earth and easier for me, so I wouldn't have to rent or buy a tiller. But my first experiment was just regular beds in the ground, and I really had a big weed problem. Then I went to more of a raised bed, and I had fence around it, but guess what? Woodchucks actually went underneath the fence and came up right in the middle of one of my beds and really just destroyed everything I had worked for. So then I decided to build the veggie fortress, as I call it, because right around me, underneath these pavers and underneath all the raised beds is hardware cloth. So if anything tries to burrow underneath the fence, they will not get through. Now, that was a very labor-intensive process, and I learned that by doing. Depending on where you live, you might not have those problems whatsoever. But I am surrounded by woods and wildlife. Now, in the process of going through a no-till garden, I became interested in lasagna gardening, and I tried that. That's where you put down like layers of newspaper and then or cardboard, and then maybe some compost, and then maybe grass clippings, whatever. You just keep layering it like you would when you're making lasagna. And eventually you are supposed to have a garden that is pretty weed-free and just beautiful soil. And I think if I would have given it enough chance, that probably would have worked. I don't think I put in enough layers of newspaper at the time, so I did have a weed problem. Well, then I discovered Square Foot Gardening by Mel, and that book really got me inspired, I think, because you know what? It's an organized way to garden. Everything is based on a 12 by 12 square, and it was something I could easily understand. So on my raised beds then, I put little thumbtacks so I could bring string through so I could make sure I knew what my 12 by 12 measurement was. And I planted things intensively by the grid that he recommended. And I actually have had great success. The problem with that method is it's expensive to start out because you don't really start with your own soil or purchase soil. You actually have to purchase extra coarse vermiculite, peat, and compost. I suppose if you had your own compost, that's fine, but that's a lot of bags, and you have to mix them together and then put them in your raised beds. The advantage is you really don't have many weeds at all because you're not putting anything in there that would generate weeds. as long as if you're using your own compost, it was hot enough. So it really was a easy method, but over time I've kind of changed. You know, I had my son raised rabbits, so we started putting rabbit manure down, and every fall I thought it was good to give him a nice, what I call, blanket for the winter, and that was shredded leaves. And you know, over time it's no longer the Mel 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 mix. It's really a mix of a lot of things. So now, why is everybody so enamored with the Back to Eden garden method? Is it really earth-shattering gardening philosophy and methods? Well, I don't think so. I think it's a mixture of a lot of garden knowledge, and then a little scripture is added into it. The basis of this, well, let me read this for you. So, for an ideal Back to Eden garden, you want to apply 3 to 4 sheets of newspaper. It's sounding a little bit like lasagna gardening, isn't it? Then apply 3 to 4 inches of organic compost or composted manure. Well, yep, that's good for soil, period, and 3 to 4 inches is quite a bit. Then an additional 2 to 4 inches of wood chips or alternative covering on top. Now, I forgot to mention one other method out there. I think her name was Ruth Stout. If it wasn't, I'll put the name here. She was back some time ago, maybe the 50s, and she advocated deep mulch gardening, which is kind of what the Back to Eden garden is. Although I believe her favorite was straw or hay at the time to use. And to put that on at least 6 inches thick, and that protected the moisture in your soil and then eventually would decompose. So the idea of wood chips for holding in the moisture really isn't something new. It's just part of the deep mulch method. Now, a lot of people confuse if you watch the Back to Eden garden. It took him years to develop his soil. It wasn't overnight. When he talks about wood chips, he's talking about chips that the power line people get from the very top, you know, when they're trimming the trees. So you really have green branches and leaves. We're not talking about big dead trees cut up. So it's got the green and the brown matter, which that's part of composting. So there's another regular garden method there. And for him, he used that because that was plentiful. He could get it free from where he was. He does state in his video, use whatever you have available. And for most people, it's no longer free. You would have to pay for it. And depending on the size of your garden, that could be a sizable expense. It also can be very hard if you have back problems or other mobility problems to actually shovel in all that wood chips on your garden, you know, move it. You can also use straw or leaves, anything else for that deep mulch. So wood chips aren't the key, I think, like most people do. They just go to the wood chips. The idea is a deep mulch to hold in your moisture. Now, the other thing that people kind of gloss over, if you watch his video, he has chickens, and he has a lot of chickens. And he now really just lets the chickens kind of create his compost, because if you've ever raised chickens, and I do, they have a heck of a lot of droppings. So they make great fertilizer for the garden. So he lets them kind of mix. He'll put, you know, various greens and stuff in there and let the chickens scratch it up and mix it, and then put that onto his garden. So again, it's just kind of a compost way. It isn't that you just put these wood chips on your soil and voila, you're going to have a great garden. It just doesn't happen that way. Now, the advantages of that method is, well, people say you don't have to water. You know, that depends where you are. You have less watering. And people say weed free. No, no, no. You have less weeds. My understanding is volunteers help him weed the garden every spring before his tours. and because he can no longer, again, he has multiple back problems and he has mobility problems. So yep, you do get weeds. He does have a little hole method, which he takes care of weeds when he sees them. But we all know weeds can be brought by birds and through the air, and the seeds deposit on top of your soil. So everybody will get weeds. Just with this deep method, it's pretty easy to pull them out. But to me, one of the downfalls of this method is, especially if you go for a 4-inch or more level of wood chips, that's a pretty heavy covering. And when you have to plant any small seeds, you know, like think of beet seeds, you have to take a hoe, take back all that covering, and then put your seeds in, because the seeds have to be planted in soil. They cannot be planted in the wood chips. So then you have to wait until the seeds sprout up, and then you can put the wood chips around them. But you know, if you have raised beds, that makes it a little bit difficult, because are those wood chips just going on top of something else you just planted? I mean, where do you put them? So for me, it isn't the greatest method. And with those seedlings, you probably better water them, because, I mean, unless you live in an area where you have enough natural rainwater, because seedlings need water, and there isn't any then wood chips holding down that moisture. So it might be the right method for you, but don't just think, oh my gosh, it's great, I'm going to have these fantastic, huge, healthy, bug-free vegetables. Remember, it took him many years to get his soil that way. You have to have the right kind of mulch, and it is more difficult when you're planting things that have small seeds as opposed to planting existing plants. The other method, which I don't hear is discussed as much, is the Middler method, and I believe that was a great method for arid, desert-like areas, and it seemed to work well as long as you had the various chemicals to add to your garden. But you know what? That looked like too much work to me, and not enough natural enough. I don't know how else to put it. So let me show you what I'm using right now. So you see a lot of straw, but I didn't put straw down in the garden. The straw was part of the rabbit manure that my husband picked up. And so we have a lot of rabbit manure and the straw spread on top. Underneath that, we have a lot of shredded leaves. And underneath that is a wonderful, wonderful composted soil that has a bunch of happy earthworms and a lot of nutrients. So I've really evolved in my garden method, and it depends on what I have on hand. So every fall, of course, shredded leaves. Got plenty of those living near woods. And before, I used to have plenty of rabbit manure. Now I actually have to buy it, but I love putting a coating in that on my garden. And I also compost our chicken manure, and so I may put that on after it's composted because it's a hot manure. And then sometimes in the summer when I'm growing things, just as an added weed protector, I put more straw around my plants. I don't use hay because that has more weed seeds. Anyway, that's what works for me. But I've kind of developed my method over many, many years. Well, this is Pepper Potpourri. I'd love to know what gardening method you use down below. Do you till every spring? Do you use the square foot gardening method? Or the back to Eden garden method, lasagna method, or your own method? Comment below. I'd love to hear what everybody is using and what has worked for you. As always, please subscribe, share the knowledge. Thank you.